October 12, 1965, Northland Shopping Center, Detroit. Rows of gleaming Mustangs, Galaxies, and Thunderbirds stretching beyond count under gray Michigan skies. Soviet automotive engineer Dmitry Volkov steps off the bus, leather notebook in hand, ready to inspect what he assumes is America's finest car exhibition. His team had built tanks that crushed Hitler's army. They knew engines, transmissions, steel. This would be routine technical analysis. Then their American guide casually mentions something that stops them cold. "Oh, these aren't for sale. These belong to people shopping inside." Volkov counts again. 347 cars on a Tuesday afternoon. If ordinary Americans own what Soviet engineers could only dream of building, what other impossible truths were hiding in plain sight? Hit subscribe for more buried Cold War stories where the real shock wasn't in the headlines, but in everyday moments that changed everything. Comment where you're watching from. These hidden histories reach everywhere. The bus wheezed to a stop beside a sign that read Northland Shopping Center, and Dmitry Volkov pressed his face against the cold window glass. What he saw defied every calculation he had made during the 16-hour flight from Moscow. Cars. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They filled the asphalt in perfect geometric rows that stretched beyond his vision, chrome bumpers catching the October sunlight like scattered mirrors. His worn leather notebook slipped from his lap as he stood, the pages filled with carefully sketched engine diagrams and production estimates that suddenly felt like children's drawings. Viktor Petrov, seated behind him, let out a low whistle that carried the weight of disbelief. "Dmitry, are we at the wrong place? This looks like the Moscow Auto Show, but bigger." The American guide, a middle-aged man named Bob Harrison, who spoke careful, textbook Russian, smiled with the patience of someone who had seen this reaction before. "No, gentlemen, this is Tuesday afternoon shopping." Volkov stepped onto the pavement and felt the vastness hit him like a physical force. The parking lot stretched in every direction, a sea of metal and glass that seemed to mock everything he thought he knew about automobile production. In his factory back home, 3 trucks served 200 engineers. Here, individual families apparently owned machines that would have been reserved for factory directors or party officials in the Soviet Union. He opened his notebook and began counting methodically, the way he had learned to document everything during his engineering training. Row 1, 37 vehicles. Row 2, 42. His pencil moved across the paper in steady strokes, but the numbers kept climbing beyond reason. "In Moscow," he wrote in careful Cyrillic script, "I know every car on my street by sight. Here I cannot count them all." The other engineers from his delegation gathered around him like bewildered tourists, their dark overcoats making them stand out against the bright American landscape. Petrov kept shaking his head and muttering about propaganda displays, but Volkov could see the genuine confusion in his colleagues' eyes. These were not exhibition vehicles arranged for their benefit. The cars showed signs of daily use: mud on the tires, grocery bags visible through rear windows, child safety seats installed in back seats. A red Ford Mustang nearby had a coffee cup sitting on its dashboard and a parking ticket tucked under its windshield wiper. No exhibition would include such mundane details. Harrison watched them process this reality with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher whose lesson was finally sinking in. "Each family," he explained in his careful Russian, "typically owns 1 car per driver, sometimes more." The sensory assault continued as they walked deeper into the lot. The smell of motor oil and exhaust mingled with the crisp autumn air, creating an industrial symphony that was both familiar and foreign to the Soviet engineers. Car doors slammed in the distance as shoppers loaded packages into trunks. A teenager in a Letterman jacket climbed into a bright yellow Chevrolet Camaro and drove away with casual confidence that stunned Volkov into silence. In his country, learning to drive required months of bureaucratic applications and mechanical training. Here, children seemed to operate automobiles as naturally as riding bicycles. The engineering implications cascaded through his mind like falling dominoes. If this many people owned cars, then the production infrastructure must be massive beyond his comprehension. The steel mills, the rubber factories, the glass plants, the assembly lines, all of it operating at a scale that dwarfed Soviet industrial capacity. Harrison led them toward the shopping center entrance, but Volkov found himself slowing down, overwhelmed by the mathematical impossibility of what he was witnessing. He had studied American technical journals for years, memorizing production statistics and manufacturing processes. But those dry numbers had not prepared him for the emotional impact of seeing abundance made tangible. "How many?" he asked Harrison in broken English, gesturing toward the endless rows of vehicles. Harrison paused to consider the question seriously. "This center serves about 50,000 families in the surrounding suburbs. Most days we see 3,000 to 4,000 cars in the lot." Volkov translated quickly for his colleagues, watching their faces mirror his own disbelief. 4,000 cars on an ordinary Tuesday. In Moscow, that represented months of national production. The group stood in stunned silence as the full implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. Everything they had been told about American industrial capacity suddenly seemed like conservative estimates. If ordinary shopping required parking for thousands of private automobiles, then the entire American economic system operated on assumptions that challenged Soviet understanding of resource allocation and social organization. Volkov closed his notebook and looked up at the shopping center building, its glass facade reflecting the sea of metal that surrounded them. Inside that building, he realized, were the people who owned all these cars, ordinary Americans going about their daily business, completely unaware that their routine Tuesday afternoon shopping trip was delivering a profound shock to a group of Soviet engineers who thought they understood the world. "What else?" Volkov whispered to himself in Russian. "Do we think we know that is wrong?" The Ford River Rouge complex sprawled before them like a steel and concrete city, smokestacks reaching toward the gray Detroit sky like the fingers of some industrial giant. Dmitry Volkov pressed his face against the bus window as they approached the main gate, trying to absorb the sheer scale of what Henry Ford had built along the Rouge River. The complex covered over 2,000 acres, larger than many Soviet cities, and the constant rumble of machinery created a bass note that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Steam rose from various buildings in white plumes, and the smell of hot metal and coal smoke filled the air even through the closed bus windows. Harrison had warned them that River Rouge was impressive. But nothing in Volkov's experience had prepared him for an industrial facility that employed more workers than lived in his entire hometown. "This is where we build the cars you saw yesterday," Harrison said simply, as if announcing the location of a neighborhood bakery. The security checkpoint alone dwarfed the entrance to Volkov's entire automotive plant in Moscow. Guards in crisp uniforms processed a steady stream of workers arriving for the afternoon shift, each man carrying a lunch pail and wearing the confident stride of someone with steady employment. The diversity of faces surprised the Soviet engineers. Black workers, white workers, men who looked Italian or Polish or Irish, all streaming through the same gates toward the same factory floor. In the Soviet Union, such ethnic mixing existed mainly in propaganda posters, but here it seemed as natural as breathing. Harrison noticed their attention and offered a casual explanation that carried profound implications. "Ford hires the best workers regardless of background. Production demands it." The pragmatic logic of American industrial efficiency had created a level of integration that Soviet ideology promoted but rarely achieved in practice. Inside the main assembly building, the noise hit them like a physical force. The rhythmic hammering of pneumatic tools, the hiss of hydraulic presses, the constant rumble of conveyor belts carrying partially assembled vehicles through various stages of completion. Volkov had studied assembly line principles in technical school, memorizing Henry Ford's innovations from translated American engineering textbooks. But witnessing the system in action overwhelmed his theoretical understanding. Cars moved through the factory in a mechanical ballet, each worker adding specific components with practiced precision before the vehicle continued its journey toward completion. The speed stunned him. Every 53 seconds, a finished automobile rolled off the line, complete and ready for delivery to dealers across the country. In his Moscow factory, completing one truck took 3 weeks of careful craftsmanship. The human details gradually penetrated his mechanical fascination as they followed Harrison through the factory floor. Workers owned the very cars they were building. The man installing dashboard components drove a Ford Thunderbird to work. The woman operating the paint spray booth had saved enough money from her assembly line wages to buy her teenage daughter a Mustang convertible. During the lunch break, Harrison led them outside to the employee parking lot where hundreds of gleaming vehicles sat in neat rows under the autumn sun. "These belong to the people you just watched working," Harrison explained, gesturing toward a collection of Galaxies, Fairlanes, and Mustangs that represented more automotive wealth than most Soviet citizens would see in a lifetime. Petrov asked the question that had been haunting all of them. Are these special workers, party members, factory directors? Harrison's answer carried the casual certainty of obvious truth. No, these are ordinary assembly line workers. They earn enough to buy what they build. The engineering specifications they encountered during the technical tour challenged every assumption about American manufacturing quality. Automatic transmissions came standard on most models, a luxury feature that Soviet engineers considered experimental technology. Power steering, air conditioning, AM/FM radio, power windows, amenities that would have been reserved for high-ranking officials in Moscow were available to any American customer willing to pay the modest additional cost. Volkov opened his notebook and began sketching frantically, trying to capture the complexity of systems that American workers took for granted. The Ford Galaxy they examined in detail featured more sophisticated engineering than the limousines used by Soviet ministers. Its V8 engine produced more horsepower than most Soviet military vehicles, yet ordinary families drove such machines to grocery stores and school events without a second thought. The production numbers Harrison shared during their briefing session defied comprehension. River Rouge alone produced more vehicles in a single day than the entire Soviet automotive industry manufactured in a month. The statistics felt like propaganda until they witnessed the physical evidence streaming past them on the assembly line. Finished cars rolled toward the shipping dock in an endless procession, destined for dealer lots across America, where customers would choose from dozens of color and option combinations. The concept of choice itself represented a luxury beyond Soviet experience. In Moscow, citizens waited years to purchase a single available model in whatever color the factory happened to produce that month. Here, customers complained if their preferred shade of blue was temporarily unavailable. As they prepared to leave the factory, Volkov found himself calculating the implications of what he had witnessed. If American workers could afford to buy the sophisticated machines they built, and if those machines were produced at this incredible scale, then the entire American economy operated on principles that challenged fundamental Soviet assumptions about labor, productivity, and social organization. The parking lot they had marveled at yesterday suddenly made perfect sense within the context of River Rouge's daily output. Perhaps American mass production, with all its apparent contradictions and inefficiencies, possessed a brutal logic that Soviet central planning had failed to match. The thought both excited and terrified him as the bus pulled away from the complex, leaving the industrial symphony of American abundance humming behind them. The Chevrolet dealership on Woodward Avenue stretched across 3 city blocks, its glass showroom gleaming under strings of colorful pennants that snapped in the October wind. Dmitry Volkov stepped out of Harrison's car and immediately felt overwhelmed by the sheer abundance displayed behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dozens of vehicles sat arranged like jewelry in a display case, each one polished to mirror brightness under the fluorescent lights. The smell of new car leather and vinyl drifted through the open doors, mingling with the autumn air and the distant rumble of Detroit traffic. This was not a factory or a government distribution center, Harrison explained as they approached the entrance. This was simply one of thousands of privately owned businesses where ordinary Americans came to purchase automobiles the way Soviet citizens might buy bread or milk. The casual tone of his explanation somehow made the reality even more staggering. Inside the showroom, a salesman named Jim welcomed them with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who sold cars for a living rather than distributed them according to state planning committees. His enthusiasm was genuine but businesslike as he gestured toward the mathematical precision of American consumer choice. Chevrolet offered 47 different combinations of model, engine, and transmission options for the 1965 model year alone, 47 variations of a single brand, displayed in a rainbow of colors that Soviet engineers had never imagined could exist simultaneously in one location. Volkov opened his notebook and began sketching frantically, trying to capture the organizational complexity required to manufacture and distribute such variety. Red Impalas sat next to blue Malibus, while yellow Corvettes gleamed under spotlights that made their paint shimmer like liquid gold. Each vehicle carried a window sticker listing dozens of available options: air conditioning, power steering, automatic transmission, AM/FM radio, white walls, chrome trim packages, engine upgrades that could transform a basic transportation device into a high-performance machine. The financing options bewildered the Soviet delegation even more than the vehicle variety. Jim spread loan documents across his desk with the casual efficiency of someone explaining a simple mathematical equation, but the concepts he described challenged fundamental assumptions about property ownership and individual economic planning. Americans could purchase automobiles with small down payments, spreading the remaining cost across monthly installments that fit within ordinary factory wages. The bank trusted individual workers to honor these commitments without government oversight or factory manager approval. Credit, Jim explained, allowed families to own vehicles immediately rather than waiting years to accumulate sufficient savings. Petrov asked the obvious question that haunted all of them. What prevents people from simply keeping the car and refusing to pay? Jim's answer carried the matter-of-fact certainty of established custom. Their reputation, their credit history. They need it for houses, other purchases. Trust is good business. The newspaper advertisement spread across Jim's conference table told a story of competition that seemed almost violent in its intensity. Full-page spreads from the Detroit Free Press showed Chevrolet battling Ford battling Plymouth for customer attention, each manufacturer promising better deals, more options, superior engineering, or lower prices. The advertisements assumed customers possessed enough knowledge to evaluate technical specifications and enough choice to reject unsatisfactory offers in favor of alternatives. In Moscow, citizens felt grateful to receive any vehicle assignment from their factory committees. Here, manufacturers competed desperately for the privilege of selling to customers who might easily choose a different brand. The mathematical implications staggered Volkov as he studied the numbers. If Detroit alone supported dozens of competing dealerships, each offering multiple brands with countless options, then the national automotive market operated at a scale that dwarfed Soviet industrial planning by orders of magnitude. Harrison drove them through suburban neighborhoods where the true impact of American automobile abundance became visible in human terms. Garage doors stood open in the afternoon sunshine, revealing the domestic reality behind the dealership statistics. The Johnson family lived in a modest split-level house that would have housed a factory director in the Soviet Union, but here belonged to an ordinary Ford assembly line foreman named Frank. His wife, Margaret, emerged from the kitchen to greet their unexpected visitors, wiping flour from her hands with casual hospitality that immediately put the nervous Soviet engineers at ease. 3 cars sat in their driveway: Frank's work truck, Margaret's shopping car, and a bright red Mustang that belonged to their 17-year-old daughter, Linda. 3 vehicles for one family. Volkov struggled to process the mathematics of such abundance, knowing that his entire neighborhood in Moscow shared fewer automobiles among 50 families. Margaret invited them into her kitchen for coffee and casually explained the logistics of American suburban life that required multiple vehicles for basic functioning. Frank drove to the factory each morning while she took their youngest son to school in a different direction. Linda needed transportation to her after-school job at the local department store. Weekend activities scattered the family across the metropolitan area for shopping, entertainment, visiting relatives, attending church, participating in community events that assumed individual mobility as naturally as breathing. The infrastructure of daily life had evolved around the assumption that every adult could access personal transportation whenever necessary. Grocery stores built massive parking lots because customers drove to purchase weekly supplies rather than walking to daily markets. Schools scheduled events assuming parents could transport children to various locations across the city. Entertainment, employment, and social activities distributed across distances that would have been impossible without universal automobile ownership. The visit to the Johnson home revealed the hidden costs of American automotive abundance that the engineers had not considered during their factory tours and dealership visits. Frank spent nearly 2 hours each week maintaining 3 vehicles, checking oil levels, tire pressure, fluid levels, and minor repairs that kept the family mobile. Margaret budgeted carefully for gasoline, insurance payments, and mechanical repairs that represented a significant portion of the family income. The teenagers worked part-time jobs partly to afford the gasoline and insurance costs associated with their driving privileges. American families had organized their entire economic and social lives around the assumption of individual mobility, creating both opportunities and obligations that Soviet citizens could barely imagine. As they prepared to leave the Johnson home, Volkov realized that American automobile ownership represented not luxury but fundamental necessity within a society that had rebuilt itself around the assumption that every citizen could travel independently whenever required. The crack in Dmitry Volkov's confidence began with a simple mathematical question that had been nagging at him since their visit to the Johnson family. Back in his hotel room that evening, he spread his notebook pages across the narrow desk and began calculating wages against automobile prices, trying to understand how ordinary American workers could afford the vehicles he had witnessed throughout Detroit. The numbers refused to cooperate with his assumptions. A Ford assembly line worker earned approximately $100 per week, according to Harrison's careful explanations, while a basic Galaxy cost nearly $3,000. Even with the financing options that Jim the car salesman had described, the mathematics suggested that American families were spending enormous portions of their income on transportation, leaving little for housing, food, and other necessities. Something about the showcase they had been shown felt incomplete, like a theater performance designed to impress foreign visitors rather than reveal authentic American life. Harrison drove them through different neighborhoods the following morning, areas that did not appear in the standard industrial tour itinerary. Here the houses stood closer together, the lawns showed patches of brown grass, and the automobiles parked along the curbs displayed visible signs of age and wear. Rust spots dotted the fenders of older Chevrolets, cracked windshields reflected the morning sun in spiderweb patterns, and some vehicles sat on concrete blocks with their wheels removed for repairs that seemed indefinitely postponed. This was still America, Harrison acknowledged quietly, but it was America without the polish of suburban showrooms and factory executive parking lots. Volkov felt a mixture of relief and disappointment as he observed this more familiar landscape of scarcity and maintenance challenges that resembled conditions he understood from his own country. The meeting with Ford Motor Company executives later that morning deepened his growing unease about the completeness of their tour. The conference room overlooked the River Rouge complex, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing a commanding view of the industrial empire they had visited with such amazement. But when Petrov asked direct questions about the environmental costs of massive automobile production, the executives deflected with practiced corporate diplomacy. Air pollution from millions of vehicles was a technical challenge being addressed through ongoing research. The disposal of millions of replaced automobiles each year was an emerging area of industrial innovation. Water pollution from manufacturing processes was carefully monitored and regulated according to current standards. Each answer felt rehearsed, designed to acknowledge problems without revealing their true scope or implications. The concept of planned obsolescence, when finally explained by a candid Ford engineer after the official presentations ended, shattered Volkov's assumptions about American industrial philosophy. Unlike Soviet manufacturing, which prioritized durability and longevity due to resource scarcity, American automobile design deliberately incorporated features that would encourage replacement after relatively few years of service. Style changes, mechanical improvements, and social pressure combined to create a system where perfectly functional vehicles became obsolete not through breakdown, but through psychological manipulation. Families traded in cars that could serve for decades because newer models offered marginal improvements or social status that the marketing system had convinced them they needed. The waste appalled Volkov's engineering sensibilities, trained as he was in a system where every component was expected to serve for maximum possible duration. The revelation about repair infrastructure added another layer of disillusion to his growing doubt about American automotive superiority. Unlike the Soviet system, where factory mechanics maintained vehicles for their entire operational lives, American automobile ownership assumed that individuals would either repair their own vehicles or pay private businesses for maintenance services. The shortage of qualified mechanics meant that minor repairs often cost more than many families could afford, leading to the premature abandonment of vehicles that Soviet engineers would have restored to decades of additional service. Parts replacement followed a similar pattern of planned inefficiency, with manufacturers designing components that required specialized tools and knowledge available only through authorized dealers who charged premium prices for routine maintenance. Alone in his hotel room that evening, Volkov stared at the photographs he had brought from home, his wife and two children standing beside their apartment building in Moscow, his own motorcycle parked in the background. The motorcycle had been built in 1949 and still ran perfectly after 16 years of faithful service, carrying him to work through Russian winters that would have destroyed the lightweight American vehicles he had observed in Detroit showrooms. His factory colleagues owned trucks and cars that their grandfathers would recognize, built with the assumption that replacement parts would be scarce and repairs would be performed by the same hands that operated the vehicles daily. American abundance was real, but it was abundance built on waste, replacement, and the assumption that tomorrow's resources would always exceed today's consumption. The emotional weight of this realization settled over him like a heavy blanket as he wrote in his diary that night. "Are we being shown a theater performance?" he wrote in careful Cyrillic script. "In Moscow, we build to last decades. Here they build to be replaced. Which system serves the people better? Abundance that disappears or scarcity that endures?" The question haunted him as traffic noise drifted through his hotel window, the sound of millions of American automobiles moving through the Detroit night, each one a monument to industrial achievement and planned obsolescence that challenged everything he thought he understood about engineering ethics and social responsibility. Tomorrow they would meet with Henry Ford himself, but tonight Volkov wondered if he wanted to hear more truth about American automotive culture, or if some illusions were more comfortable than the complex reality behind the gleaming facade. The silence in the hotel room felt heavier than the Detroit smog that drifted through the half-open window. Dmitry Volkov sat on the edge of his narrow bed, surrounded by 3 days' worth of notebooks filled with sketches, measurements, and observations that no longer formed a coherent picture of American automotive superiority. His colleagues moved restlessly around the small space, Viktor Petrov chain-smoking American cigarettes while staring at the traffic below, the other engineers sorting through promotional materials and technical specifications that seemed to mock their original confidence. They had come to Detroit as experts, men who understood engines and production systems and industrial organization. Now they felt like children who had discovered that the adult world operated according to rules no one had bothered to explain. "What do we tell them when we return?" Petrov asked quietly, voicing the question that had been haunting all of them since their visit to the older neighborhoods and their uncomfortable meeting with Ford executives. Volkov pulled out the photograph of his family and stared at the faces that seemed impossibly distant after only a few days in America. His wife Elena stood beside their modest apartment building, holding their youngest daughter while their son proudly displayed the bicycle he had earned through excellent marks in mathematics. Behind them, Volkov's own motorcycle gleamed in the Moscow sunlight, 16 years old but maintained with the careful attention that Soviet citizens learned from childhood. Everything in the photograph represented permanence, durability, the assumption that objects were built to serve for decades rather than seasons. The American system he had witnessed operated on completely different principles, creating abundance through planned replacement rather than careful conservation. Both approaches served their people, but they reflected fundamentally different values about resources, individual responsibility, and the relationship between production and consumption. The telephone call that changed everything came at 7:30 that evening, just as the engineers were preparing for another restless night of doubt and confusion. Harrison's voice carried unusual excitement as he explained that Henry Ford II himself had agreed to meet with the Soviet delegation the following morning. Not in the formal conference rooms they had grown accustomed to, but in his private office overlooking the Rouge River. The meeting had not been scheduled, Harrison explained. Ford had simply heard about their visit and expressed personal curiosity about their impressions of American automotive manufacturing. The informality of the invitation somehow made it more significant than all the official presentations they had endured. Here was an opportunity to speak directly with the man whose grandfather had revolutionized industrial production, whose company had become synonymous with American manufacturing achievement. Henry Ford II received them in an office that reflected both corporate power and personal humility. Its leather chairs and mahogany desk balanced by technical drawings pinned to the walls and engine components displayed on bookshelves like intellectual trophies. Ford himself appeared younger than Volkov had expected, his handshake firm but not performative, his manner suggesting genuine interest rather than diplomatic obligation. He spoke directly about the contradictions the Soviet engineers had observed during their Detroit visit, acknowledging the environmental costs, the waste inherent in planned obsolescence, and the social pressure that drove families to replace functional vehicles for psychological rather than mechanical reasons. "Your system and ours serve different purposes," Ford said simply, settling into his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent years thinking about these questions. "You optimize for durability because replacement is difficult. We optimize for innovation because replacement drives progress." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and covered territory that no official presentation would have dared to explore. Ford acknowledged that American automobile abundance came with costs that Soviet central planning avoided: environmental degradation, resource waste, social inequality that left some families unable to participate in the mobility that others took for granted. But he argued that the competitive pressure created by consumer choice drove technological innovation at a pace that centralized systems could not match. Safety improvements, efficiency gains, and manufacturing innovations emerged from the brutal logic of marketplace competition, where failure meant bankruptcy rather than bureaucratic reorganization. Soviet vehicles lasted longer, Ford admitted, but American vehicles improved faster, each model year incorporating advances that took Soviet designers decades to develop and implement. The mutual respect that emerged during this honest conversation surprised all the participants. Ford asked detailed questions about Soviet manufacturing techniques, particularly their approaches to durability and resource conservation that American companies were beginning to recognize as valuable. Volkov found himself defending Soviet industrial philosophy while simultaneously acknowledging the impressive achievements of American mass production. The two systems, they realized, had evolved to serve different social priorities rather than competing to achieve identical goals. Soviet engineering excellence focused on making things last under conditions of scarcity. American engineering excellence focused on making things better under conditions of abundance. Both approaches represented legitimate responses to their respective social and economic environments. As the meeting concluded, Ford walked them to his office window overlooking the Rouge complex, where the afternoon shift was ending and thousands of workers streamed toward the parking lots filled with vehicles they had helped to build. "The real question," Ford said quietly, "is whether either system can learn from the other without losing what makes it effective." The handshake they exchanged carried the weight of mutual recognition between engineers who had devoted their careers to serving their people through industrial innovation. Volkov left the meeting with his assumptions about American automotive superiority permanently altered, but also with profound respect for the technical and organizational achievements that had created the abundance he had witnessed. The American system was not superior to the Soviet system, nor was it inferior. It was different, shaped by different constraints and serving different values, but deserving of serious study rather than ideological dismissal. Back in his hotel room that final evening, Volkov wrote carefully in his diary about the lessons he would carry home to Moscow. American mass production had achieved remarkable things, but at costs that Soviet planners had been wise to avoid. Soviet manufacturing had achieved different remarkable things, but had missed opportunities that American competition had revealed. The real victory would belong to whichever system could learn from the other's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses, adapting foreign innovations to serve domestic priorities rather than abandoning proven approaches for fashionable alternatives.